Okay, in this video I'm going to be talking about just some background information dealing with quadratic equations, some things that you need to know before we progress any farther. First of all, we need to know what a quadratic equation is. And anytime you see a quadratic equation, the basic idea is that somewhere in that formula we have an x squared, and that is the largest power of x that we have. So we don't have x cubed or x to the fourth or anything like that, but we don't have like y equals mx plus b either, like x to the first power. So we're talking quadratic equations. And really, here's a few examples here. No matter what form I write it, maybe I can do something like this. X squared plus 11x plus 10 is equal to 0. That would be an equation, right, because it has an equal sign, and it has x squared as its biggest power. Therefore, it is a quadratic equation. I could even rearrange if I wanted to. Maybe I move that 10 over, and I say something like x squared plus 11x equals negative 10. Well, that's still going to be a quadratic equation because it's an equation and the highest power is x squared. I can move the x squared by itself if I wanted to. Maybe I do something like this. X squared is equal to negative 11x minus 10. Well, that's still an equation, and x squared is still the biggest power. Therefore, these are all three examples of quadratic equations. Things that might not be a quadratic equation would be something like this. 3x minus 4 is equal to 0. You see how that's not one because it doesn't have the x squared, does it? Right? So we can't consider this to be a quadratic equation. We can't consider something like x cubed plus 8 is equal to 0. That's not a quadratic equation because it has a cube. And so this is not an example. But basically, no matter what kind of quadratic equation we have, it has an equal sign and an x squared, they can all be written in the same form. And this is the general form of a quadratic equation. It's going to be written like this. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. And all that's saying is a, b, and c are numbers. So maybe we have like a 2x squared plus a 3x minus a 4 is equal to 0, right? There would be an example in that format. So we have a number times x squared plus a number times x plus some number, and it can be positive or negative. And we notice that we go from x squared down to x to the first power down to no x at all. And so they're going to write in decreasing powers of x, and that's the general form of a quadratic equation. There's one other piece of information I want to talk about before we go any farther, and that's called the zero product property. So this is kind of separate, a separate note. If I have two numbers that multiply to give me 0, the only way that this can get, now notice, not adding, but multiplying. The only way that this can happen is if either that a is equal to 0, that's one way, so maybe I have 0 times 4, right? Or, so a would be 0, b would be 4, right? See what I'm saying? Or you have like 0 times 100, or 0 times really anything, 0 times pi, that's all 0. So either the first number can be a 0, or the second number can be a 0, right? So here, let's get weird here. 4/17 times 0. Can you do fractions? Can you do big number? Here we go. 6/13 plus 2x squared minus 4. And I'm going to take that whole thing, I'm going to multiply it by 0. Well, guess what? If this chunk, I don't care what this is because that's a 0. The whole thing ends up being a 0. And what we're going to see is later on, we're going to do some problems that end up looking something like this. X plus 3 x minus 4 is equal to 0. Well, here, if you see this, instead of looking at this as four different things here, look at it as two things. There's the first one. There's my a, and here's my b. And I'm going to multiply a times b, right? And the only way that this thing can be equal to 0 is if either the first thing, a is 0, or if the second thing is a 0. And this is how I'm going to solve quadratic equations later on. We're going to see that in the next video. If that makes sense, you're ready to go on to the next video where we're going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations using factoring.